Welcome to our live webcast on the Building Inclusive Cultures by Speaking Up About Microaggressions. My name is Catherine Hall, and I will be providing features of the web event technology, managing the chat, and presenting the sessions. Today, we are joined by Baran, but before we get started, I'd like to take a moment and acquaint you with a few features of this web event technology. At any time, you may adjust your audio using the computer volume setting that you have. On the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see the Q&A chat window. There is a large window which holds all of your sent messages and a smaller text box at the top where you would type in your questions. To send a question, please click on a text box and type your text. When finished, click the Ask button. Your question will be responded to at the end of the presentation as time permits. Today, we are joined by Baran. We're extremely excited. He is the co-author of a recently released book, Subtle Acts of Exclusion. He inspires individuals and supports organizations as they create and sustain cultural change. As a social scientist and senior partner and digital solutions lead at Inquest Consulting, Michael brings innovation and deep understanding to wide audiences, helping them think, lead, and interact inclusively. In addition to consulting, Michael has taught at Harvard University and worked as a principal researcher at American Institutes for Research. Please join us in welcoming Michael Baran to discuss building inclusive cultures by speaking up about microaggressions. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Catherine. And welcome, everyone. So excited to be here with you. Kind of wish we were all in a room together, but we're going to make this work. And so I want to just do a very quick introduction and acknowledgement of my co-author, Tiffany Jana, who's a brilliant, amazing person to work with on this book. This book has a lot of the ideas that I'm going to talk about today come from this book. It was just released in March, so it is hot off the presses. So excited to be sharing these ideas with you. So just wanted to make sure to acknowledge Tiffany. I don't think there's that much more I need to tell you about myself. I used to get haircuts, you can probably tell. Now I got this funky thing going on with my virtual background. I am not loving how it makes me look like I got a hair helmet, but that's all right. So I am a social scientist by training. So when I look at these subtle acts of exclusion that we're going to talk about, I understand them as a cultural anthropologist. That's what my doctorate's in, a cultural anthropologist and a cognitive psychologist. So studying what are these subtle ways that some people get included in cultures, in organizations, and other people get excluded. Because we've got to look at the explicit stuff and the more subtle aspects of this. So that's really what I'm excited to share with you today. All right, I want to start out, before I even start talking to you about the details and the theory and all that, I just want to get us in the space of what that means, what these subtle acts of exclusion are. So I'm going to play you 3 short video clips. These are videos of people. I went around with a professional videographer and I interviewed people and I just asked them, what are the subtle things that you experience that make you feel excluded at work? And so I'll use some of those clips in this presentation. So I'm just going to play you 3 of them with the Zoom and your streaming platform delay. The video, I think, is going to be a little choppy and probably a little disjointed from the audio, but you can still get the main idea. So I'll play you these 3 short clips.
Professional, that's another thing that can be trying to be a compliment. You're very professional. Like, what does that mean? Like, as opposed to what? As opposed to who?
Okay, number 2.
I think when I talk something about like a past boyfriend or something, like just in a normal conversation when I've sort of met people for the first time, or sometimes when I'm working through my work with community members or things like that, there's a pause, and I'm not quite sure how it's going to be received, but I actually don't care. And typically it's like, okay, that's fine. But there's usually always a pause first.
My physical ability to perform for my job, there's a physical requirement for my job as well. And despite how well I score on it, and I do pretty well, I'm almost at like a perfect, it's always, oh, well, you did that pretty well for a female. You did a lot of that, especially for a female. And it's like, I mean, thank you, I guess. But at the same time, it's like, I'm not like, I'm just trying to do my best, and like, it shouldn't matter if I am a female.
Okay. So I want you all to think about, have you experienced something like this before, right? Whether it's because of race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, disability, religion, age or generation, weight, anything, right? Have you experienced something like this before? Just think about it. You don't even need to type it into the chat or anything. Most audiences that I'm talking to, people are like, yes, absolutely, 1000%, yes, right? And then I'll ask folks, have you worried that you've said something like this before? Maybe something specific's coming to mind that you've been ruminating on, maybe even for years, right? Or maybe it's just a general feeling like, yeah, this topic's so sensitive. I'm sure I've said something like that, right? And for most folks, again, this is like, yeah, definitely, right? And then, do you feel like you could have a productive conversation about it if it happens at work tomorrow, right? And here, people are usually like, no, I don't, right? So here we are in this situation where people are experiencing these kinds of things often. They're worried they've said something like this before, and we all have probably. And yet, we don't feel like we could have a good conversation about it, right? So that's kind of what we're going to talk about today, right? We're going to talk about these kinds of interactions at a deep level, what some people have called microaggressions, okay? We're going to talk about a more productive term that Tiffany and I wrote about, subtle acts of exclusion. I'm going to tell you about that. We're going to uncover why these subtle acts of exclusion are such a big problem and how they work to exclude people, and then learn some practical guidelines for how to have good conversations about them in ways that actually bring us together, okay? That's what we're gonna do. So I want you to think about whether you've heard this term microaggressions before, right? Probably a lot of folks attending this conference have heard that before, right? I'd be willing to bet you have. When you just ask people on the street if they've heard this term before, most people say no, they haven't. Or yeah, I've heard it, but I don't quite remember what it means. Or is that like micromanaged, right? Something not quite in the same vein as what you might be thinking about. So I don't want to take for granted that people know what this term means. I want to do some quick level setting here. Here's some examples. This was a project done by Kim Kayun, where she went around and asked people, write down the most common microaggression that you experienced, okay? And these are what people wrote down. I'm gonna read them out. So like, what are you? Can you see as much as white people, because of your eyes? Why do you sound white? You don't speak Spanish? So what people have meant by microaggressions are those times when people aren't necessarily trying to cause harm, right? They might be trying to ask a question. I mean, in some of these cases, they might be, right? They might be trying to cause harm. What people have meant by microaggressions are those times when they're not really trying to cause harm, but maybe trying to ask a question out of curiosity, maybe trying to bond with you, maybe even trying to compliment you. And that's the intention. And the impact, however, on the other person is something very different, right? So that's what people have meant by microaggression. The term itself has been around for a long time, since the 1970s. Now, what's the big deal with these things, right? Well, the big deal is when we think about exclusion, exclusion doesn't happen at work typically by people walking in and going, I wish you weren't here. I don't like you. I don't like your ideas. It's usually not that explicit. Exclusion usually happens way more passively and way more subtly. And yet it's still a huge problem, right? So they do these fMRI, brain imaging studies, and they'll expose people to like a subtle exclusion. And then they'll look at the brain scan imagery, and they'll look at what part of the brain lights up when people experience that exclusion. And guess what? The same part of the brain lights up as the part that lights up with physical pain. These things literally hurt us, right? And get in the way of all sorts of other things. They get in the way of our perceptual awareness, our mental clarity, our problem solving, our decision making. When they happen consistently, they cause mental and physical health problems, right? A huge problem. When they happen at work, right? Besides all that, they also they tend to make people want to get out, get by, or get even. First, get out, like I'm finding another job. If I'm being excluded consistently, I'm looking for a different place to work where I'm going to be more valued and included. Or I'll quit and stay. I'll just do the bare minimum to get by. But if I'm being excluded, I'm not going to give my full self, my whole creativity, all my energy, right? I'll just get by. Or I might be subtly looking to even sabotage things, right? Maybe not so subtly. So here we have this situation where, before I get into that, here we have this situation where we've got this incredibly serious issue that's causing people to experience physical pain, mental and physical health issues, decreased job satisfaction. It's bad for organizations, this incredibly serious problem, right? And so I'd be called in, this was years ago, called in to do microaggressions workshops with people, right? And so I'd go in and I'd try to work with organizations on this topic of microaggressions. Now, when I did that, I would often get these three very unhelpful responses, right? So first, I get people saying, well, we might say, okay, so you called that Black man articulate, that was a microaggression. And people would say, I wasn't intending to be aggressive at all. This extreme defensiveness, right? Or you can't call it a microaggression if you don't know what the person was thinking. So the term microaggression is taking us on a tangent. It's focusing all our attention on the intention of the utterance and not the impact. It's taking us away from what really matters. So that wasn't helpful. Second, people who experience these things, right? You saw that slide a minute ago. It feels terrible, right? And yet that word micro, they didn't necessarily mean it like this when they coined that term back in the 70s. But what that word micro means to us these days is small, not important, right? So when people hear microaggressions, it's like they're getting slighted all over again because it doesn't feel micro at all. It feels terrible, right? And so people are feeling slighted, and everyone is kind of feeling like, well, if this is just a micro problem, why are we really talking about it, right? We got bigger things to worry about. Just forget this, right? So what Tiffany and I said is, okay, we were like, this is really, that term is getting in our way of doing the work, right? For years, I would kind of grumble about this term under my breath, like, someone needs to think of a better term for this. And so I started this brainstorming list. talking to Tiffany, who I had known for a while, and they were like, yeah, I'm feeling the same exact thing. So we got together and said, well, if someone needs to think of a better term, might as well be us. So we put our heads together and decided to reconceptualize this whole thing, including reframing the term itself. So we said, let's just call these things what they are. They're subtle acts of exclusion. So first, subtle. They don't feel subtle. That's when they're happening to you, right? That's not what we mean. But the subtlety is what makes it so they keep happening. So they don't quite hit that threshold of like, oh, I know I need to report this. I know I need to say something about this, right? It's more like, did that just happen? Should I say something about this? Is it appropriate to say something about this? Did they mean anything by this? And people end up not saying anything. And so we're stuck in the same situation. So that's what the subtlety is all about. Second, they're acts, right? They're things people say and do. They're not intentions. They're not character judgments. It's just something said and done. And we can talk about that. And then we thought, let's name the problem right in the term itself. They create exclusion in the moment, and they perpetuate patterns of thinking where people with marginalized identities are being consistently excluded. Huge problem, okay? So that's what we ended up coming up with. Now, this is super important. What we wanted to do, and this is where that social science analysis comes in, is we wanted to look at, okay, when one of these subtle acts of exclusion, or sometimes I'll call them SAE, when one of these SAE happen, on the surface is one thing that's being explicitly said, but underneath the surface, what's being implicitly conveyed, right? So when someone asks an Asian American, oh, where are you from? Where are you really from, right? On the surface, it's a question about heritage, right? Explicitly, but what's being conveyed implicitly? You don't belong, right? Or maybe you're not normal. When a woman gets cut off in a meeting, right? Not given credit for their ideas, what's being conveyed? You're invisible, right? When a Black man is on an elevator and a white woman walks in and clutches their purse a little tighter. All of these examples I've given are real stories that people have told me. When I did those interviews in the beginning, I interviewed 100 people about the kinds of things they experienced. So these are all real stories from that, and from all the literature that's out there, all the stories we've been told, that Tiffany and I have been told in our years of working in this field, all the things we've experienced. Obviously, Tiffany identifying as Black, gender non-binary, LGBTQ, experiences way more of these things than I do as a white man. We brought all that experience to bear. We looked across all the different dimensions of diversity, and we ended up saying, across all of these different examples of subtle acts of exclusion, what are the 8 most common things that are getting implicitly communicated? That's how we came up with this. So you don't belong. You're invisible. You're a threat. You're not an individual, right? Maybe you're an Indian American person and your name keeps getting confused with the other Indian American person in your organization, right? You're not an individual. When a Black person is experiencing someone saying, you're so professional, like that first video I showed you, or you're so articulate, or you're so well-spoken, right? On the surface, a compliment. Underneath the surface, you're inadequate, right? Because I didn't expect you to be. You're a curiosity. You're not normal, and you're a burden, right? So these are all the things getting implicitly communicated under the surface. And we're going to talk about why that's important to think about. But first, I want to play you 3 more clips. But now, as I play these, this time I want you to think about, of those 8 things, what's being implicitly conveyed when this person experiences this subtle act of exclusion. Okay, so I'll start with the first one here.
Like internet usage. Oh, well, you millennials are always on the phone. You millennials, you don't ever look up from your apps.
Okay, so you millennials are always on your phone. You millennials, don't look up from your apps. Maybe share in chat. I'm not going to see your chat, but share so other people see. Which one of these do you think is being communicated here? If you're like most groups that I'm talking with, there's some differences of opinion, right? Some of you might be saying you're not normal. Some might be saying you're not an individual. Some might be saying you're inadequate, right? And those are all possibilities. So this is a great time to pause and to talk about how complex this is. There's no one right answer here, right? It can be multiple things at the same time. And we don't know, right? We don't know what she's feeling in that moment. It has to be something that she shares with us, right? And so it's such complicated human stuff. So she might feel this as a subtle act of exclusion one day, but not a different day because of whatever else is going on in your life. She may feel this as a subtle act of exclusion, but someone else who's also a millennial doesn't feel like it's a subtle act of exclusion. She may feel this as a subtle act of exclusion when one person says it to her, but not when another person says it to her. She has different relationships with those two different people, right? So this is very complicated human stuff. All right, here's another example.
And so they won't say anything, and we could kind of notice that whether that's walking on a sidewalk and they jump out of the way, or if they kind of like, you know, flatten themselves up against the wall so we don't run into them and we still kind of brush up against them, that kind of thing, where a simple hi would probably give me more of an audio cue to walk around or greet as well, or avoid, you know, the collision that may happen or whatever it is that they're scared of.
Okay. So what's being communicated there? Which one of these, or which multiple ones of these do you think? Obviously, like I just said, we don't know, right? Until he tells us. But what do you imagine? I imagine folks might be saying, you're not normal, right? I hear that a lot. You're a burden, right? And all of those are true, right? And because he explained it, right? In this interview, he explained that to me. And this is such a clear example of, and a great time to pause to think about the spectrum of these acts of exclusion. On one side of the spectrum are very explicit, intentional acts of exclusion. That happens, right? They may absolutely be aggressive, right? That's happening on one side of the spectrum. On the other side of the spectrum, we have examples maybe like this, whereas he explains, I know people aren't intending to do anything bad. I know they're trying to be as helpful as they possibly can to me, right? As I walk down the hall, they're trying to literally like flatten themselves up against the wall to help me get down the hall better. And yet that still makes me feel like a burden, like I'm not normal. And there's such a simple fix, right? So many times with these subtle acts of exclusion, people ask like, well, how can I do anything? How can I say anything? What am I supposed to do? You can't compliment someone. You can't try to help someone. There's usually such a simple fix, right? So in this case, he says, if you just said hi to me walking down the hall, that would help me navigate the hall better, right? And feel normal. And maybe I have a question I want to ask you related to work, right? So there's so many benefits. And usually when people hear that, they go, oh, of course, I'll do that differently now, right? And other examples, though, people get way more defensive about. So this is one where people are usually not getting very defensive, like, oh, that makes sense. And other ones people do get defensive about. So it's very interesting to notice that within yourself sometimes, right? Here we are talking about the I. Notice that within yourself. Which things are you feeling not at all defensive about, or maybe defensive about? It's okay to notice defensiveness. It's a powerful kind of feeling. Notice it and think about it, right? And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. I want to give one last example here.
You know, absolutely. It's one of those things where you start talking to your counterparts and no longer are they talking to you. They're talking to, you know, the other male in the room, or, you know, someone else that, you know, they can relate more with, especially if it's from different cultures.
Okay. So no longer talking to you, right? Talking to the other male in the room or someone they can relate more with. What do you think's being conveyed there implicitly? I can pretend like I'm seeing chat. You're invisible. Yep. You're not an individual. Right? So these are really common. And it's important to understand that these subtle acts of exclusion are happening universally, right? Everywhere in the world. And yet the ways they happen, right? The cultural kind of boundaries along which they play out are different in every place, in every space. That might be related to even within the country, even if you're in the United States, what region are you in? What city are you in? Right? These all, what organization are you in? These play out differently in different spaces, even though they're always happening, right? Now, why are they happening? For a variety of reasons. These are some of them. So lack of familiarity, right? We tend to live in kind of socially segregated spaces, right? For a variety of reasons, everything from policy to biases to fear, all sorts of things, right? To property values. And so we might just not have familiarity with people who are like us along different dimensions of diversity. It's not like you never thought about what it means to be blind, maybe, but maybe you've never walked through a day with a blind person and seen what it takes to navigate a hallway or to get into a car or whatever it is that they're doing, right? And so we just don't have that familiarity. And maybe related to that, we don't have that comfort. So many of these subtle acts of exclusion happen as people try to demonstrate their comfort with things that they're actually kind of uncomfortable about. So one of the interviews I did was someone in a wheelchair who was explaining, you know, people try so hard to show him how comfortable they are with it that it ends up excluding him, right? He said, I'm making jokes about the wheelchair, like, no, don't go getting a speeding ticket with that thing, or, you know, something else like that. He's like, I get it. They're trying to show me they're comfortable, but when it happens again and again and again to me, what do you think the effect is, right? It's telling me the only thing people are seeing about me is my wheelchair, because that's what people are talking to me about. Or, you know, a gay woman was explaining to me that so many of her friends are like, oh, I wish I was gay, right? They're trying to show how comfortable they are with it. And she's like, I get that. And yet, if that's what you're saying, it makes me feel like you're not really seeing some of the ways that it's hard to be gay, to not be heterosexual in this society these days, right? So there's that. And then there's bias, right? Conscious bias or unconscious bias. Obviously, conscious bias would be something that you know you have. You could voice it, then it's conscious. If you really don't know you have it, then it's unconscious. And there are a lot of those biases that we have, right? Where we really don't even know we have it. So that whole exercise of, you know, why is that language so important? Why do we go through those videos and try to pick out language around impact? Why do we try to build this deep understanding of what's really going on in those moments? These are three things that are really important, okay? First, allyship, okay? This is super important. We all are talking a lot about allyship these days. Sometimes people are talking about, well, allyship's not enough. We need something else. We need active allyship. Allyship is not something that you can do passively. It's not something you can do in your head. You've got to be active, right? You've got to do things to be an ally. And yet, if you don't recognize, the first step would be just recognizing these subtle acts of exclusion when they happen to someone else. If you don't recognize it, you can't speak up as an ally, right? So first, for example, sometimes I'm speaking with groups and I'm like talking to them about the research showing that women get cut off more in meetings, that don't get credit for their ideas as much as men. And the men in the room will turn to the women and say, well, that's not happening here, right? And the women are like, are you kidding me? Yes, that's happening here. And so if men aren't even recognizing it, they can't speak up when it happens to stand with their colleagues, right? And so we need to build up that understanding with everyone for what other people really go through, right? And not and taking it seriously, right? So understanding what other people are experiencing, the impact that words and actions have on them in a real way is super important for allyship. And we need allies. Some people are exhausted, have tried speaking up about these things and it's not gone well and are like, forget it. Other times people are not having the energy because of disparities in society and maybe loss they've experienced and racism and other things they're experiencing, racial trauma, and don't have the energy to speak up about these things, right? Other times they have a huge risk for speaking up about things. And so allies who don't have the same risk, who don't have the same exhaustion, who don't have the same trauma, who have the privilege of being able to speak up about these things in a way that it's not going to come back to hurt them. They're especially important if we want to all do this. Okay, so that's allyship. Second, right, if you're gonna talk about these things, we talked in the beginning here about how people don't feel like they could even have a good conversation about it. And partly that's because of our vocabulary. We're stuck with what we've been stuck with, talking about things like, well, that was racist, that was sexist, that was homophobic, right? And that all, it's not necessarily super specific or helpful for talking about impact. And we'll get into that more. But the bottom line is we need a language for being able to talk about impact in a way that gets us somewhere good. And then third, you've all probably gone to lots of talks or done lots of trainings on unconscious bias, right? What's one of the things that people do when they talk about unconscious bias? Okay, well, we've got to make our biases conscious, right? Then we can reflect on them. Then we can do something about them, right? We got to bring them from the unconscious to the unconscious. And great, yes. And how do we actually do that? Well, if someone gives you feedback that something you said was a subtle act of exclusion, what a window and opportunity that is to maybe uncover some unconscious biases you didn't even know that you had. So it's an incredible opportunity, actually. All right, so we've kind of recognized the problem, right? These things are happening. They continue to happen. We're actually not making a ton of progress on them, and people are not speaking up about them, right? That's part of why they keep happening. Now, why aren't people speaking up about them? They might be worried they're going to cause a conflict. We like our interactions to go smoothly. Conflict is scary for many of us. We may be very conflict avoidant, and we don't want to do that to ourselves, right? Especially at work, it's even more scary. Where we might be worried about embarrassing someone or hurting their feelings. We don't like to do that. We might be thinking, well, if it's not happening to me, it's none of my business. I better not get involved. Right? That's especially a big barrier to allyship. We might think, I don't know that person well enough to say something. I don't know if they're feeling excluded, right? And instead of like asking the other person or starting that conversation, we just don't say anything. People may be worried that they're going to get labeled as too sensitive or get stereotyped, right? So many Black women told us, I'm I don't want to be stereotyped as the angry Black woman, so I'm not going to say anything about this, right? And that's related to the risk that I talked about. Some people have way more risk for speaking up about this, and so they don't, right? Other people might be worried, okay, well, I don't want to say something wrong in the process of trying to help, and then all the heat's on me, so I'm just going to pretend like I didn't hear it or didn't notice it, right? So these are all getting in the way of people speaking up about this stuff. And yet, there are so many benefits if we are able to have these conversations, right? Increased feeling of inclusion for people with marginalized identities, and everyone really. And inclusion, I don't think I defined inclusion the way I mean it. Inclusion meaning feeling welcomed, everyone feeling welcomed, valued, respected, heard, and understood, right? That's how I'm thinking about inclusion. So everyone feeling that. More trust and authentic relationships across difference. Everybody's talking about wanting authentic relationships across difference and real trust. This is how you build it in these conversations. More collaboration across teams throughout the organization when people aren't holding on to resentment, right? Aren't feeling excluded. Improved ability to give feedback on other issues. If you can give feedback on this, which is super hard and sensitive, you can give feedback on all kinds of other hard things. And so that's valuable. And then just a culture of interpersonal kindness, yes. Transparency and openness, yes. And also accountability, right? That's super important. There are organizations right now where people are scared to death to have these conversations. I worked with a veterinary hospital who said, we're so scared to have any conversations related to race in any way. We are scared to say Black lab when a Black lab dog comes in for treatment here, right? That's how hard things are here. And that's the opposite of what our goal is, right? Our goal here is more grace for people, more kindness, more open conversations, more dialogue, and more accountability. This is not sugarcoating. This is not pretending these things don't exist, right? Accountability. And some organizations have clear paths when something is egregious, right? Okay, I've got to go to HR, or there's a hotline I can call if I want to do this anonymously, or I go to my supervisor. But what about these subtle things that maybe don't hit that threshold yet of I know I need to go to HR or report this or call the hotline. What about that? This is what we're talking about here. And we need accountability for that stuff too, because of the seriousness of the issue that we already talked about. Okay, so let's say you're on board then, and you want to have these conversations, right? Let's get real with thinking about some practical steps. So first, just start with yourself and be aware of what's going on. How am I reacting physically and emotionally, right? Subtle act of exclusion just happened, well, to me, or I witnessed it. What's going on with me, right? What am I feeling? Who's around? What's the context? Where are we? Are we in a super important meeting where we've got 10 minutes left to make some big decisions? Maybe that's not the right time. Just like, what's going on here? Are there assumptions I'm making maybe about other people? Or do I have hot buttons that I know that maybe are making me especially upset about this? Take stock of that. Who's around me? What are their backgrounds? What are their perspectives? Do I even know, right? Or am I just making assumptions? And am I ready for this conversation? If you're not ready for it, it's probably not going to go good. So being super intentional about it is really important. And then, this slide and the next slide are pretty key if you want to come out of this talk with some practical, actionable things to do, right? Which I think is really important for any talk like this. So what Tiffany and I did, and what I do with other people that I work with, is we try to say, okay, when these conversations don't always go well, you can probably think of examples in your head of them not going well, right? When they did go well, what were the factors that led to it going well, right? And so we picked out 4 guidelines at the top here for people who want to call, for who experience the subtle act of exclusion or want to be an ally, to call the other person in rather than calling them out. There's so much talk about call out culture, cancel culture. It feels great maybe for a second to call someone out on Twitter, to call someone out on Facebook. If we work with this person, if we have a relationship with this person, it's not necessarily the thing that's gonna be most effective for us. So how can we call out the behavior, the action, but call the other person in? So these are 4 things that we found are helpful. And then below it, some actual words that could come out of your mouth, right? So first is just pausing the action, right? What that means is so many times you see or you experience a subtle act of exclusion and you're trying to think of the perfect thing to say. And it's complicated because it's subtle. And so you're like, how do I talk about this? Can I say this? Can I say that? By the time you kind of figure out how you might want to talk about it, the moments pass and it's easier to let it go. And that's what people are doing. They're letting it go. So instead, before you even know what you want to say, if you can say, just pause the action, right? By just saying, hold on a second, can we pause? I don't even know yet why I'm feeling this or how I'd talk about this, but can we discuss what was just said, right? And then later figure it out. Just pause it first, right? Then second, assume good intent. If the intent is good, by the way, intent is not always good. And if it's not, don't pretend like it is. That's what we wouldn't say that, right? But if it may be, assume good intent explicitly. I'm presuming you didn't mean anything bad by this. I assume your intentions were good. You may not even know why this would make me feel this way. If you're able to do that, you're going to inoculate against some of the extreme defensiveness the other person is likely to feel. And we'll talk about that on the next slide, right? Now, there may be people in the audience, I've certainly had people who are like, I am so sick of this. I am not in a space where I care to be evaluating whether the other person's intent was good or not, right? And totally hear that. And yet, right, if you want to have a conversation about it, this is a helpful tool. And this can be especially helpful for those allies who are not as exhausted by this, right? So that's especially important. Then explore together. Rather than setting up an adversarial kind of situation, think about the we, right? The people involved as the unit. So this just happened. Can we talk about it? Can we explore together how we use those words here? Can I share with you how this impacted me? That's so powerful. And then use that language that we talked about to explain the impact. When you said that, it made me feel invisible. That might make someone feel not normal. Those words might make her feel like she doesn't belong here, right? Use those specific words to talk about it and build understanding. So those are helpful guidelines if you're the person experiencing the subtle act of exclusion or the person who wants to stand with your colleagues and say something to support them as an ally. Now, what about if you're getting that feedback that what you said or did was a subtle act of exclusion? You have a huge responsibility, okay? First, what a gift. What a gift that that person has spoken up and said something, right? We all want to be better people. We are trying so hard to do it, and it's hard. And what a gift that someone has risked their own comfort to tell you a way you could be a better person. You could be more inclusive. Being explicit with your gratitude. Thank you for speaking up. I appreciate you sharing. I'm glad you said something, right? You might be feeling a mix of emotions, some of which might not be very glad the person is speaking up because you're feeling bad about yourself. Of course, that may happen, right? But if you can reframe it in your own mind as a gift, That's really powerful. And then, if you're human, you are going to probably feel defensive. And we've seen this happen so much. No, I didn't mean it like that. No, it's just that, right? No, you want to defend yourself and your intention. Recognize that, feel it, breathe through it, and then put it away and understand the impact that your words or your actions had on the other person first, right? That's got to be the first thing you do. Can you tell me more about this? Can you help me understand how this impacted you? Or just listen. Listening is so much harder than we think it is. Really listening to the other person from their perspective and not filtering it through your own experiences, not thinking like, well, I wouldn't have thought that. Well, that wouldn't have made me feel bad, right? Not that. Understand from their perspective. That's your goal. Then use the opportunity to grow, right? Grow as an individual. Hey, it's important to me to learn from this, do some self-reflection, do some research, whatever the subtle act of exclusion is. I pretty much guarantee you can type into Google, why shouldn't I say this? And get incredible resources in a nanosecond, right? Do that research, put in the work. The other person might be explaining impact, and that's great, but it's not their responsibility to explain to you everything about the situation or the hundreds of years that have led up to this moment. You've got to do that work on your own, right? And then grow the relationship, follow through, follow up with everyone involved. I thought about what was said, what you said. I want to check back in with you. Our relationship is important to me. When someone is being vulnerable and sharing with you about impact or about a subtle act of exclusion, that moment is really loaded. If you don't take that feedback well, you will build a barrier between you and that person, maybe forever, right? And if you do take it well, if you take it and do something about it and use it to grow the relationship, you will build trust. That's when the trust building happens. That's when the real relationship happens. So that when you do these things, which we all will, people will give you grace, right? Someone giving you real feedback about a subtle act of exclusion is also communicating to you, I think you have the ability to take this feedback and to be better and to be closer to me, right? That's part of the gift of it, right? And so we've got to take those moments super seriously. And then, of course, the end result of that, right? Instead of those other things that were on that other slide, instead of people feeling you don't belong, you're not an individual, right? You're inadequate. Instead of that, everyone feeling you're understood, you're welcomed, you're valued, you're respected. You are seen and heard as an individual. That's what we can do if we take this all seriously and we create cultures of real inclusion, not just for the explicit stuff, but for the subtle stuff as well. Okay. This is my info. If you wanna, get in touch, stay connected. If you want to ask me a question that you don't get answered here, I think I've left about 10 minutes to answer questions. If you didn't get your question answered, please feel free to get in touch with me and I will get in touch back. Okay. Catherine, you want to come back on? There you are.
Yes, Michael, thank you so much. This was so amazing. You're getting so many kudos and thank you. And I love the presentations in the chat, so we appreciate it. We have about 10 minutes to go through some really great Q&A. You have some questions waiting for you. So I'm just going to jump right into it.
Yeah.
So the first question is related to your earlier conversation. With all of the explicit violence and racism happening, why should we be thinking about subtle acts of exclusion now?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Such a great question. I Okay, I'm going to answer that in two ways. First, because obviously there's very explicit violence, racism that we see, right? We see it's in our faces and it's intense. And if you think about an iceberg, right? And a lot of people use this metaphor, that's what you see above the waterline. That's the tip of the iceberg there. And underneath it is so much going on that supports that. It's all the unconscious biases that we have. It's all the cultural ways that people are subtly included and excluded. That all is the foundation on which that more explicit stuff rests. And we need to break up that foundation if we also want to do something about the more explicit stuff. If we want to create more inclusion, if we want to create more equity, if we want to change the way that people are interacting and thinking about one another, we've got to break up that stuff under that waterline of the iceberg as well. So that's one way I would answer that. And I guess there are three ways. The second is that we're not solving exclusion and racism tomorrow. We are in this for the long haul. And as we go through this, the next decades of work that are going to have to go into this, we need to be thinking about all of it, the explicit, the implicit, the explicit and the subtle, and really doing something about all of it, all the subtle messages, even the ones that our kids are seeing right now. Our kids growing up, our little babies growing up are getting subtle messages of inequality right now. They're not explicit ones, they're subtle ones. And we needed that kind of nuance in the way we approach it. And then finally, after the murders of, George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and so many others, with this new awareness that some people are having. This is not new that it's happening, and it's not new awareness for so many people. But for some people, there's kind of a new awareness, and they're trying to talk more about these issues, trying to engage more. And as they're doing it, they're committing subtle acts of exclusion all over the place. And so we need to be able to have those conversations to build a bigger tent and to really do something about this in our organizations and in our society as well.
Great answer. Thank you so much. Our next question is, how can organizations actually do something about these subtle acts of exclusion?
Yeah, another good question. So the first step is to recognize that these are happening, right? We can't pretend that this is an isolated incident, right? Research out there, I was looking at the McKinsey study on women in the workplace, right? The amount of subtle acts of exclusion or microaggressions that women are experiencing in the workplace on a daily basis is it's staggering, right? So don't pretend this is some isolated, odd example. Understand these are happening frequently. They're a serious problem. And we are going to collectively decide as an organization to do something about it. We're not going to tolerate that here. So we're going to set up systems and guidelines and then get everyone on the same page with this. So that means, right? So we're doing trainings with leaders, deep, in-depth, interactive trainings with leaders to get them on board with this as a project for the organization. Trainings with managers, with your people managers, who are the ones who are often hearing about these things, who need to understand how to have these conversations, what's the problem, and how to go about solving some of this and bringing people together on that team. And then for everyone, right? So we have in-person trainings that we're doing, or I guess in-person virtual trainings that we're doing, and also digital trainings and practice. So it's about building understanding and also just practicing these guidelines, practicing what you would do if you're the person who experienced the subtle act of exclusion, the person who wants to be an ally, the person who gets the feedback, because we're all going to be in those different roles at different times. This isn't about separating the good people from the bad people, right? We are all going to be in those different roles. So getting on the same page with what those guidelines are, so you can recognize, oh, hey, you're not following that guideline about understanding impacts, you're getting defensive. And the other person can go, oh, right, I remember that. Okay, breathe through the defensiveness, focus on impact, right? So you can all kind of collectively do it together. That's when we can make real progress and change the culture.
Love that. Love that. We have just a few more questions. Let's see. One really great question: for a person with a physical disability, is there a good approach to offering assistance with a door, navigating, or maneuvering around things that they have to carry? Do you ask to offer help, or is there like a good or bad wording to do so?
Yeah, great. I mean, in those instances, right, it's different for every person depending on how they want to be approached. But a general guideline I've seen be effective is something like, how can I be of assistance? Just a simple question that lets the other person, they can say, no, I'm good, I got it. Or, oh, this is what you can do, right? You're not making assumptions about what they might need or not need. You're just offering a hand if they want it. I found that helpful for people. And just treating people normally and seeing people. Sometimes people have this, I've heard so many stories from people with disabilities of people not even making any sense when they address their disability. Like one woman was explaining she is deaf. And so when she goes into an airplane, she tells the flight attendant that she's deaf so that everyone's aware in case there's some verbal instructions. And she said she sat down in her seat and the flight attendant then came over with instructions, emergency instructions in Braille. And she was like, and so she said in that case, she decided to respond with humor. She like rubbed it on her ear and was like, it's not working. Right. But people just not even really understanding or seeing what it means to have that disability. Getting some more familiarity is so important with what people go through.
Love that. Oh, you're getting more kudos in the chat.
Yay.
Another question: have you used the term teaching/learning moments to help frame opportunities to grow?
Yeah, absolutely. I've seen that. I've heard that. That I tend to think more about that idea of bringing people together on sort of an equal plane. Like teaching moment implies that one person is doing the teaching to the other. And while that may be true, people often don't want to feel like they're being patronized or like they're a student. And so we just try to keep people on the same plane and talk about bringing people together, right? For exploring together an issue and how we could come together and not have those things happen anymore, right? And so really having patience with people, but really also expecting progress, right? If you give someone feedback on a subtle act of exclusion and they keep doing the same thing without making an effort to get better at it, the intent isn't good anymore, and then you're in a different situation. And so these guidelines are great for those initial conversations, but if people don't take it well, then you're in a different kind of situation.
Awesome. And I have another question for you. People are asking about resources and recommendations. What was the name of your book that you mentioned earlier?
Yeah, it's called Subtle Acts of Exclusion: How to Understand, Identify, and Stop Microaggressions. And that's, it's at Amazon and it's at everywhere else. You can also go straight to Barrett Kohler Publishers and buy it. Got audiobooks and ebooks and everything you could want. And we also have just finished this fantastic digital learning path that can be scaled out very widely to organizations that uses some of those videos to build an understanding about what people go through, and also has really common scenarios that we had a graphic novelist illustrate, and you can kind of go through them in this choose your own adventure sort of way from the different perspectives. If you said the subtle act of exclusion, if you experienced it, or if you're an ally, and practice different things you might say and what might be the response and How could you do it better? It's that sort of, we need coming together, real conversations, and sometimes you just need some practice on your own too, to get it so they're really ingrained, really, so you feel it in your bones and you can act differently in the real world when these happen, because they're going to happen.
Good, good. Well, thank you so much. This was so awesome.
Thank you,
on
Catherine.
behalf of Greenville Chamber's 4th Annual DEI Summit and presenting sponsor Michelin North America, I would like to thank Michael Baran for your participation in this event. At this time, you may log out and transition into the next segment of today's summit as per the agenda. This concludes this session. Thank you so much and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, Catherine, and thank you everyone for being here. Take care.
Thank you so much.
All right.